lecture hall buzzed with the typical post-class chatter. Students were animatedly discussing the day's lecture, their voices blending into a symphony of academic enthusiasm. I slung my backpack over my shoulder, eager to escape the stuffy room and the lingering scent of dry erase markers. As I made my way down the steps, a voice called out, "Hey, you dropped this." It was Brian, a classmate I vaguely recognized from a group project we had worked on earlier in the semester. In his hand, he held a worn, leather-bound book that looked like it had seen better days. I smiled awkwardly. "Thanks," I mumbled, taking the book from him. "I didn't even realize." "No problem," Brian chuckled. "Heading home?" I nodded, unsure where the conversation was going, but curious nonetheless. "Mind if I walk with you?" he asked, his tone casual yet inviting. "I wanted to pick your brain about the assignment," he added, his eyes lighting up with genuine interest. We walked together, our conversation initially revolving around the complexities of ancient philosophy, dissecting the nuances of Socratic thought and Platonic ideals. However, the discussion took an unexpected turn as we delved deeper into the realm of existence and belief, exploring questions that had puzzled thinkers for centuries. It was a conversation that left me pondering long after we parted ways. Do you ever wonder about what happens after all this? The question seemed to come out of nowhere, catching me in a moment of quiet reflection. Brian asked suddenly, gesturing vaguely towards the bustling street scene around us. The noise of the city seemed to fade into the background as his words hung in the air. His question caught me off guard. It wasn't something we usually talked about, especially not in the middle of a busy day. "After what?" I asked, pretending to misunderstand. "After life," he clarified, his eyes searching mine for some kind of reaction. The question hung in the air between us, creating a moment of introspective silence. It was as if time had slowed down, allowing us to ponder the enormity of the question. It was a topic I tended to avoid, one that always left me feeling uneasy and uncertain. The unknown has a way of doing that to people. Honestly, I admitted, I haven't given it much thought. It was partially true. I often found myself pushing those thoughts away, not wanting to confront them. Thoughts of death and the afterlife did flit through my mind occasionally, usually in the quiet moments before sleep or during moments of unexpected anxiety. They were fleeting, like shadows in the night. I just preferred not to dwell on them. It was easier to focus on the here and now, on the tangible aspects of life. Yet I confessed that, deep down subconsciously, there's a part of me that clings to the notion that there is something beyond this life. "I get it," Brian said, nodding understandingly. "It's a big question, one that doesn't have an easy answer." "Well, I think the reason for your subconscious belief is that God had implanted the thought of immortality in our hearts so that we might search for Him," he suggested with a faint smile and bright face looking directly in my eyes. As we continued our walk, the conversation lingered in my mind. Maybe, just maybe, it was time to start thinking about the bigger questions in life. "Hope?" I echoed, skepticism tinging my voice. The concept of an afterlife, of a heaven and hell, always seemed more like a comforting story than a tangible reality. But what if it's all just an illusion, a way for people to cope with the fear of the unknown? Brian smiled faintly. "Maybe," he conceded. "But what if it's not? What if there's more to life, to existence, than what we can see and touch?" His words struck a chord within me, a tiny part of me, a part I usually kept buried under layers of logic and reason, yearned for something more, for a reason to believe that death wasn't the end. We continued walking, the city sounds fading into the background as we became engrossed in our conversation. "Look at the world around us," Brian said, gesturing towards a nearby park. "The intricate design of a leaf, the vastness of the universe, the perfect balance of nature. Don't they point to something greater than ourselves? A creator?" I had always appreciated the beauty of nature, marveling at its complexity and resilience. But to attribute it all to a divine being, that seemed like a leap of faith I wasn't sure I could make. "I see the order," I admitted. "But couldn't it just be the laws of physics, the result of billions of years of evolution?" Brian nodded. "Perhaps. But even then, where did those laws come from? Who or what set the universe in motion?" We walked in silence for a moment, both lost in our thoughts. The gentle sound of a stream nearby brought a sense of peace. Brian finally spoke again, his voice soft. "Maybe it's not about finding definitive answers, but about appreciating the mystery and wonder of it all." I smiled, feeling a sense of connection to the world around me. Perhaps in the end, it's the search for understanding that brings us closer to the divine. And in that search, we find a deeper appreciation for the beauty and complexity of life. He paused for a moment, his gaze fixed on the horizon. There's a parable in the Bible, he continued, Luke chapter 14, verses 16 to 24. It talks about a man preparing a great banquet and sending out invitations, but one by one his guests make excuses. Brian went on to recount the parable, how the invited guests declined the invitation, citing various reasons: business deals, property purchases, family obligations. The host, angered by their indifference, then invites the poor, the crippled, the blind, and the lame to fill his table. The banquet, Brian explained, represents God's kingdom, his offer of salvation and eternal life. The guests who make excuses are those who prioritize worldly possessions and pursuits over a relationship with God. His words resonated with an uncomfortable familiarity. I thought about my own life, the countless times I had prioritized work, commitments, and even trivial distractions over deeper reflection, over exploring the spiritual realm. Were these my excuses? So what about you? Brian asked, bringing me out of my thoughts. What's stopping you from accepting the invitation? His question was direct, almost disarming. I didn't have a ready answer. I don't know, I admitted. It's not that I don't want to believe. It's more like I'm afraid of what it might mean, of the changes it might require. Brian smiled understandingly. Faith isn't about blind acceptance or rigid rules, he said gently. It's about opening yourself to the possibility of something more, of a love that transcends our understanding. He continued, the banquet is always open, the invitation always extended. It's up to us to decide whether we'll accept it or continue making excuses. His words lingered in the air as we walked in comfortable silence. The setting sun cast a warm glow over the city, painting the buildings in hues of orange and purple. For a moment, the world seemed to shimmer, as if the veil between the physical and the spiritual had grown thin. As we reached the corner where our paths diverged, I felt a strange reluctance to end our conversation. Brian's words, his unwavering faith, had stirred something within me, a flicker of curiosity that I couldn't easily dismiss. Thanks, Brian, I said sincerely. This conversation, it really got me thinking. He smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners. Anytime, he replied. Just remember, the invitation is always open. I continued walking, my mind awhirl with thoughts and questions. The encounter with Brian had left an undeniable mark, planting a seed of curiosity in the fertile ground of my doubt. As I made my way home, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was standing at a crossroads, an intersection between the familiar path of skepticism and an uncharted territory of faith. Perhaps, just perhaps, it was time to explore a new direction.